Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today and attending the Women's Heart Health Atlas Epidemiology, Diagnosis, Management of Cardiovascular Diseases in Women webinar series. Today, we're highlighting our latest chapter publication, Chapter 3, which is Patient Perspectives, Women with Experience Living with Cardiovascular Disease. My name is Dr. Sharon Mulvagh, and I am a cardiologist and professor of medicine at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I'm also the co-director of the Women's Heart Health Clinic and the past chair of the Knowledge, Translation, and Mobilization Working Group for the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. Today, I'm co-moderating with my colleague, Dr. Colleen Norris. Dr. Norris is a professor and clinician scientist with the University of Alberta's Faculties of Nursing, Medicine, and School of Public Health in Edmonton, Alberta. She is also the past chair of the Health Systems and Policies Working Group for the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. And today we have a really special treat because we have two wonderful speakers who will be joining us. Ms. Hope Sarfi is a woman with lived experience located in Richmond, British Columbia, and is a member of the Knowledge Translation and Mobilization Working Group of the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. Dr. Tracy Colella is a clinician scientist and associate professor in the faculties of Nursing and Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Ontario, where she works at the Toronto Rehabilitation Centre at the University Health Network. Welcome to Hope and to Tracy. But there's a few technical notes before we get started. All participants have been muted and the video sharing capabilities have been turned off to minimize any disruptions. If you have any issues with your sound, please do your troubleshooting by going to your audio settings. And if you still can't resolve it, please chat in the chat box. We're going to reserve the chat box for any technical issues or any comments you might have. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen with the chat icon. Of course, we would love for you, and we hope you have lots of questions for our speakers, and we would request that you put those in the Q&A box, and that's also located down at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function as indicated. At the end of the session, you'll be provided with a link to an evaluation form, and please complete this evaluation as it really helps us with our planning for future educational sessions. Finally, of course, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available next week on the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance website, where you can also find all the other Atlas chapter webinar sessions that we've done, and there'll be more coming up in the future. And there are many more webinars there too for heart health information that pertains to women in particular that may interest you. Today, none of our presenters have any disclosures relevant to the content of the presentation. Excuse me. And we do have a disclaimer though, and that is that we can't provide specific advice on individual medical problems because we are unable to, we have to obviously protect patient privacy. And today we're also not discussing any specific cardiovascular diseases. Our focus will be on the context of the patient's experience with cardiovascular disease in the general sense of accessing care and the challenges and tools in coping with this new diagnosis or existing diagnosis, and hopefully to be able to help contribute to thriving in a new normal situation. Future chapters, however, and webinars that we'll do will deal with specific cardiovascular disease or disorders. First, I'd like to turn it over to Colleen. And Colleen, would you like to share exactly what we hope we're going to accomplish in this session today?
Thanks so much, Sharon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Really exciting to be doing this on our Chapter 3. Start my video. So we are going to hope at the end of this presentation or webinar, you'll be able to describe what the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance is and just be able to hear and understand the experience of women living with cardiovascular disease. We want to identify the barriers to accessing acute cardiovascular care for women and list the action items to open the gates to women. And finally, we want to identify what women with lived experience can do to participate more fully in one's care and recovery. We are hoping to do a little poll here. We'd like to get to know you all, and we'd ask that you answer whether you're a patient or a person with lived experience, a caregiver, a healthcare provider, a researcher, or are in another category. Thank you, and we'll share the results in a few minutes.
So
go ahead, Sharon. Thank you.
yeah, as I hope everyone's had a chance to we're good to go with the great. Okay. So we've got the poll done. Excellent. And we are going to share it now or a little bit later, Lisa? A little later. Okay. It looks like over half of us are persons with lived experience. So that's wonderful. And about a quarter are healthcare professionals with researchers and other. And we'll find out what that is maybe in the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us. So next slide. Great. Let's just review why we're all here today, though. You know, what is the status of cardiovascular disease in women in North America? And the graph on the left shows the trajectory of mortality from cardiovascular disease in women, particularly in the States over the last few decades. And you notice that the line is going down. And indeed, initially, though, it exceeded that of men since about 1984 until around 2015, when it actually dipped under the mortality rate for women from cardiovascular disease dipped under that for men. And this was attributed to major advances in prevention, diagnosis, and treatment and for both men and women, obviously. But concerningly, you'll notice that the lines are going back up again towards the right of the graph. And it goes out to 2017. And you can see that we're actually losing the advances that we had initially gained with the mortality rates over the last few years. And it's true that in Canada too, cardiovascular disease is also a leading cause of death. It's very, if you could advance to the next slide, I'd like to just share with you that there's some fantastic data that was presented just yesterday at the ACC, American College of Cardiology, which is being held virtually this year, obviously because of COVID again, as part of announcing a newly launched Lancet Commission on Cardiovascular Disease in Women. It's a global effort to try to reduce cardiovascular disease in women around the world. And you can see in this that in the graphs that the top two lines are unfortunately Canada and the US, with an uptick in cardiovascular disease mortality in women over the last few years. And this shows particularly that those midlife women are having an increment in cardiovascular disease. So what's been our response? Well, we formed, next slide, please. We formed in 2018 the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. And this is because we recognize that, disturbing issue with the 5 unders that we talk about, the under awareness, the under diagnosis, under treatment, under research, under supported. And we planned to develop this alliance with the mission that we would be able to improve women's cardiovascular health across the lifespan. And with the support of clinicians, scientists, patients, and decision makers working collaboratively, we could implement evidence and transform clinical practices and actually impact public policy, which is really key to being able to improve women's cardiovascular health. So we're kind of ahead of the game. The Lancet Commission is actually trying to do this on a worldwide basis, and we're doing it here too in Canada. And as part of the pillars of our Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance, we have 4 working groups, and you're going to hear more about those in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is the formation of the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. And I just want to point out that we have learned, since we developed it, some very important things, and we have adapted how we have organized things. First, we have become more inclusive by including a CV trainee representative, and you see here Dr. Andreak, who is with us. But most importantly, we no longer have single chairs for the working groups, but we have co-chairs with equal representation by both a healthcare professional, clinician scientist, and a patient advocate, are women with lived experience. So now I'm going to turn over to Colleen to tell you just a little bit about each of the working groups, and then we're going to do the deep dive into Chapter 3 with Dr. Colella and Ms. Sarfi. Colleen.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I'm here back in Alberta. I was answering questions, and which I wasn't supposed to do till the end. But anyways, I would like to tell you about our working groups. And this is the Advocacy Working Group. And on February 13th, for 3 years now, we raised awareness about women's heart health in Canada with the Wear Red Canada Day It has grown in leaps and bounds, and we had a very successful February 13th, where all across Canada, different parts, different groups organized different events. And that's what the advocacy group was working on and continues to work on. The knowledge translation and mobilize, the next group is the training and education working group. And the training and education working group are identifying education modules that can be used for medical, nursing, any kind of healthcare positions. And they are available with education courses and teaching tools. They could also be used for rounds or anything along those lines. And it's to identify, to help actually the clinicians understand the differences in women's heart health and heart health issues. Next slide, please. So Sharon and my group are the knowledge translation and mobilization working group, and I was the health system and policy working group. And we determined that we needed to get together in order to develop a consensus document and figure out where we are as far as women's heart health and heart health evidence is concerned, in order to create a policy document to say this is where things need to change. Next slide, please. As a result, I'm going to get organized here. There we go. With over 35 authors from across Canada, including a number of women with lived experience, we published in February 2020 a position paper in a highly rated scientific journal that provided a spotlight on the current state of the science in women's cardiovascular disease. And this article painted the picture in really broad strokes on all of the issues on Canadian women's cardiovascular diseases. Next slide, please. As a result of the document that we created in order to create the policy or the publication in CWHHA, we had actually 75,000 words that we had to get down to 7,500 for the document. So we decided to use all of that evidence and all of that work that had gone into it to create the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. It is 9 unique chapters, and it's on a journal called the CJC, or Canadian Journal of Cardiology Open. And it was specifically put on there because that is open to anybody, public, medical, anybody who wants to go on CJC Open. And if you go onto it, you will, over to the right, there's a place where you can click, and it's the Women's Heart Health Alliance. And the editor is Dr. Michelle Graham, who has kindly helped us facilitate this whole process. The first one was published in April 2020. Second and third have been published there, and we have moved on where I think we're actually getting to the 5th and 6th to be submitted and published. Today, we are actually going to be speaking about Chapter 3, Patient's Perspective, and are really excited to do that. Next slide, please. So this is an example of Chapter 3 that we're going to discuss today. And as I said, you can find it on CJC Open, and it's the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance Atlas on Epidemiology and Diagnosis and Management of Cardiovascular Disease, specifically the patient perspective. So let's review the results of the poll. And then Tracy, can you tell us more about Chapter 3?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Norris. I'm delighted to be here today to share Chapter 3 with everyone. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what this chapter entails. And as you can see in the infographic, it outlines 3 key areas that we highlighted in this chapter. And first off, starting off with the experiencing and living with CVD as a woman, and really presenting the unique common challenges that women with lived experience do live with and in their recovery. And in a few moments, Hope will be sharing her journey. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. The next section really focuses on highlighting some of the evidence, objective evidence, that really specifically speaks to the misunderstood, misinterpreted, misdiagnosed, and mistreated, equaling a big mistake. So really focusing on those elements that really we need to
target in order to improve women's cardiovascular health and outcomes in Canada. And then the chapter culminates with key action items or recommendations that are women specifically titled Opening the Gate to Women, what our patients need and want. And we outline in here, as you can see outlined under specific categories: primary care, institutional environments, educational environments, research, policy, and then conclude with what patients can do. So these are key recommendations that will be essential in order to focus on change at all levels of healthcare and ensure that specific strategies are implemented to improve these cardiovascular outcomes for women. So without further ado, I'm delighted to turn it over to Hope, who is going to share her journey with us. She is one of our women with lived experience. And thank you again, Hope, for sharing this story with us.
You're welcome. Hello, my name is Hope Sarfi, and I am from Richmond, British Columbia, and I am a heart attack survivor. In February 2014, I was sitting at my desk and started perspiring and had sharp heartburn pain and shortness of breath. I had no knowledge of heart attack symptoms, but my body just didn't feel right. So I immediately went to the ER. I was admitted right away, and they gave me a test that said that I was having a heart attack. So I knew nothing about heart disease or risk factors. My risk factors did not give off any major warnings to my physician because they were looking at family history, which I had none at the time. I later learned that my biological parents both died of heart attacks, and I'm glad I listened to my body. I was fortunate to have my ER physician send me for angiogram at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. He said it was frowned upon to order these if you were not a specialist. I was scared of the angiogram because one of the side effects was death. It was discovered that I had 90% blockage in my coronary arteries, and my heart stopped 2 times during the procedure, and I had to have open heart surgery the next day. I was frightened and confused and wondering on what's going to happen now. So much so that when the cardiologist came to tell me about what happened at the angiogram, I was too stunned to ask questions. My family that were with me were anxious and worried. My daughter in Vancouver felt helpless. When we said goodnight before the surgery the next day, we both were in tears, but I reassured her that everything will be all right, although I was not sure at all. After a week, I went home armed with the Canada Food Guide, physio exercise schedule, and an appointment to start cardiac rehab at University of Ottawa Heart Institute. When ready, it was unnerving to leave the hospital because I felt there, without leaving the safe place with all the healthcare. I started to change my lifestyle with healthy eating and exercise and lost 35 pounds. I was recovering and had support from family and friends, but something was missing. Fortunately for me, in 2015, the Women at Heart support group was launched at the Heart Institute in Ottawa. I immediately joined. The Women at Heart program is a peer support program led by women with heart disease for women with heart disease. It provides a caring environment for women to learn and support each other. The program provides women with emotional and education support. What a difference it made in my life. The Women at Heart program helped me move on psychologically and enabled me to adapt to heart disease as a lifelong condition and empowered me to take charge of my health. I knew I was not alone. In 2016, I was invited to participate in the first Canadian Women's Heart Health Summit in Ottawa. It was so emotional experience for me as I got to see firsthand that important changes were being made to bring awareness of heart disease to women nationally. It made me want to do more. A few years later, I had the opportunity to join the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance to help grow the awareness in women's heart health, and I jumped at the chance. Not only do I get a voice as a patient partner, but I am also participating in the Wear Red campaign held on February 13th. And I gave several interviews on TV and in Reader Digest to help bring awareness to women living with heart disease. I still keep in touch with my heart friends, and we are still there to support each other. You too can help by becoming an advocate or spreading the word to friends, family, and using networks to increase awareness. The more women are aware of this silent killer, the more women can be saved. This is so important, and the critical need to focus on the patient perspective. We felt this quote so eloquently described the live experience of women, like fears, emotions, stress, urgency, hope, aloneness, very many emotions, and supports what the culmination of literature reports. My experience of being an advocate, part of the Alliance groups and part of this writing, makes me feel that we are going in the right direction in supporting women's heart health, and we are being heard. Which is why I'm so actively involved in the Women at Heart program, Alliance, and online support groups. I really encourage others to join in becoming advocates and taking part in the Wear Red Canada and other awareness activities. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Hope, for sharing your story and your ongoing journey of recovery. And you've become so involved in the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance, and we so appreciate your perspective and sharing that with us today. And this quote is actually included in our publication. And as Hope said, it's just such an impactful, powerful statement. So thank you again, Hope. And next slide, please. So I'm just going to be going into, continuing a little bit more on experiencing and living with CVD as a woman from the objective evidence perspective or side of things. As presented in the Chapter 2 Atlas that was spoken of and previously presented, women have a very unique health risk factor profile. And this is also very sensitive to race, ethnicity, cultural, sex, and gendered impacts. So with traditional risk factors, they pose significantly greater morbidity and mortality impacts than in comparison to men. And as I mentioned, with race and ethnicity, specific populations experience more severe impact of risk factors, such as high blood pressure and diabetes in Black and Hispanic populations. And women also have greater mortality in the year following a cardiac event and are more likely to have poorer outcomes compared to men. So the unique risk profile results in or coincides with a unique recovery experience. And although women's experiences and personal recovery remain poorly described in the literature overall, what is published is primarily reflective of the first year following a cardiac event or procedure. And studies have shown that women experience a lower degree of perceived health during the initial recovery and really are in need of strong support in order to deal with higher levels of fear, anxiety, depression, and stress, post-traumatic stress included in there, all of which impact not only their physical recovery, but also psychological recovery. And there is limited data that suggests that even after 5 years following a cardiac event, ongoing fear and anxiety have been described by some. So really reinforcing the importance of targeting early recovery and really facilitating that recovery. Some other key components that have been outlined in the literature are partner relationships. And these can also be impacted, as well as intimacy, due to the sometimes changing dynamic in the relationship, with sometimes partners becoming much more overprotective, which can impact both positively and negatively in communication, as well as the pre-illness equilibrium in relationships. So really a focus on establishing a new normal in all facets of life. Social support in the form of family and friends has also been identified as integral, excuse me, in recovery. Family can provide significant strength and comfort. However, some women identify that social roles within the family often will take precedence over their personal recovery needs. And this may be stressful, as well as limit the ability to focus on personal recovery and functional health. As the literature has strongly suggested, women tend to put caregiving roles, household responsibilities, and others ahead of their own recovery needs, which ultimately can impact their own recovery trajectory. And finally, peer support. The shared lived experience of individuals who have been through this recovery has been recognized as key to recovery, both physically, emotionally, as well as impacting psychological outcomes, motivation, confidence, and specific behaviors such as participation in cardiac rehab or peer support opportunities, as well as educational opportunities. So next slide, please. Our next slide, we just wanted to also overview that we do have, I wanted to just mention this briefly before we go into the polling question, but we do have 53% women with lived experience in the audience today, 27% healthcare providers, and 10% researchers. So a full complement. So we just would like to take this opportunity to really get your engagement. So if you could please launch the poll, which of the following statements is true? And I'll read through these as we give you an opportunity to respond. So the majority of Canadian women identify diabetes and high blood pressure as risk factors for heart disease. Option 2, fewer than 50% of Canadian women identify smoking as a risk factor for heart disease. 3, awareness of risk factors for heart disease has increased significantly among ethnically diverse women. And 4, younger women aged 25 to 34 years report the highest level of awareness of postpartum factors for heart disease. So we'll just give you a moment to answer. And next slide, please. There we go. Sorry, I'm waiting for the poll. Okay, so 44% of you got the answer correct, which is fewer than 50% of Canadian women identify smoking as a risk factor for heart disease. 42% indicated that the majority of Canadian women can identify diabetes and high blood pressure as risk factors for heart disease. And then 9% responded to the risk factors increased among ethnically diverse women, and 4% indicating the younger women report the highest level of awareness. So in fact, B is the correct answer. And we'll go to the next slide. So as you can see, fewer than 50% of Canadian women identify smoking, as a risk factor for heart disease. And in fact, substantial gaps in knowledge regarding cardiovascular disease, the symptoms and risk factors in women remain evident in Canadian studies. One Canadian study of the Ottawa Heart Institute showed this statistic that we just polled you on, but also identified that less than 25% of women being able to name other leading risk factors such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and high cholesterol. And this was a study that was completed in 2013, and it was a national study of approximately 1,600 women. So as you can see in the bar graph located on the right side of the slide, this is another question that was asked in this survey. What are possible symptoms of heart disease that a woman may experience? And when asked to name these possible symptoms, fewer than half of the women named chest pain, 43%, excuse me, and 38% named shortness of breath or difficulty breathing while exercising. Women younger than 45 years of age were generally less apt to identify other possible symptoms. So really focuses on the lack of awareness that is still quite troubling for our Canadian women. Next slide, please. Excuse me. And so often, as we see in what Dr. Mulvagh was referring to, the data initially, we see mirroring in both Canada and the US. The American Heart Association recently released what they called shocking report, which it is, which were results from a national study, a survey completed in 2019, focused on examining public health awareness related to coronary heart disease, results from this national survey. This showed that knowledge of cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death in women had declined from 64.8% in 2009 to 44% by 2019. So with lessened awareness, particularly notable among Hispanics, Black, and young women. And as Koch and Heyman followed with a commentary, as you can see below, their comments 2 steps forward and 1 step back seems very apropos when speaking to women's awareness of heart disease and risk. So these data really do reinforce the lack of knowledge and continued disparities among women. Next slide, please. So this has resulted in heightened urgent calls for efforts to engage and educate women in order to reverse these recent trends and to make up for lost ground. And these may look very familiar to many of you, as far as historically and in the recent past, targeting knowledge gaps and inequities. Recent public awareness campaigns such as Heart and Stroke, Misunderstood Report, Where Read Canada, the Canadian Heart Health Strategy, as well as for our American counterparts, the Go Red for Women, among many other US education programs around heart disease. These have raised awareness, as we did see in the previous slides. But unfortunately, despite these awareness campaigns, we're seeing a lack of awareness persisting among the lay public as well as the healthcare professionals. So there's a large gap that we need to proactively address in order to increase awareness of symptoms, risk factors, and women's overall health issues. So next slide, please. So moving on, just to overview briefly one of the sections of the paper, Stopped at the Gate, which is what our women eloquently called this, both Stopped at the Gate and then the next one that we'll be covering. But barriers and access to care. So we've provided some context or background, but women have described a serious barrier to access to acute cardiovascular care, one of which referring specifically to emergency departments. When presenting with symptoms that might differ from those traditionally associated with the male presentation of heart disease, and these are multifactorial issues or variations in symptom presentation and profile that women have. And although women experience chest pain, the language they may use may differ from the historically gender nuanced language. For example, women may instead describe chest pressure or tightness versus crushing chest pain. Therefore, traditional risk stratification tools may lead to the under-recognition of sex-specific presentation, misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis, or delayed recognition of symptoms. And the Heart and Stroke Foundation reported in the Misunderstood Report that symptoms of early heart attack were missed in 53% of all women seen in emergency departments, with fewer classic symptoms of chest pain and other symptoms that were focused on fatigue, nausea, weakness, arm, back, or jaw pain, palpitations, loss of appetite, just to name a few. So bringing this back to the lack of suspicion for an acute coronary syndrome diagnosis, which may result in a domino effect regarding symptom recognition and resulting standard of care or target benchmarks not being achieved for women specifically. And for example, women receiving ECG within 10-minute benchmark, 30-minute thrombolytic therapy benchmarks as well. So clearly there is a need to focus on education and establishing clinically diagnostic protocols that can improve the recognition, treatment, and survival of women in their recovery as well. Next slide, please. So coming back to our infographic, this just really reinforces the misunderstood, misinterpreted, misdiagnosed, and mistreated equals a big mistake. And just highlights, we have lots of work left to do. Although much has been done, there's more that needs to be done. And the action items to open the gate, as our ladies eloquently put this as well, to women, what our patients want and need. So next slide, please. So highlighting some of the actions to open the gate. So this is the culmination of recommendations that we speak of from the literature, as well as most importantly from the women with the lived experience of cardiovascular disease and recovery. So there's a need to address and recognize and also address the unconscious bias that may be present when women present with symptoms which fall into the differential diagnosis of cardiovascular event, where the introduction of procedural changes and checklists for clinicians can be used to improve diagnosis and treatment. Previous research has shown positive effects of such checklists, and an example of this would be the Cleveland Clinic 4-step activation criteria for STEMI protocol, which has been published. As well, among this list is the important establishment of sex and gender specific clinical diagnostic protocols for emergency departments and primary care physicians that specifically address known differences in women's risk factors and variations in symptoms. Awareness is another big factor. Provider awareness of supportive resources that are available to women following their discharge from acute care, such as cardiac rehabilitation, this being identified as a priority referral and standard of care. Care providers need to be aware of these resources, talk to the patients about these resources, as well as provide contact information. Having supportive conversations has been especially highlighted by women, and one specific element is that direct connection between the heart and mind, not only for all patients, but especially for women. And moving over to the right side of the slide, looking at institutional environments, and this includes holistic wellness programs, as well as peer support programs, cardiac rehab, also focusing on care pathways that become part of the pathway at each institution. The research shows that peer support, these educational programs, and just overall care provider support can really improve patients' recovery trajectory, as well as their attendance at these programs and understanding of health, as well as improve their confidence. One other element that the women really did highlight was creating an open, supportive culture that respects patient perspectives and provides support for open and collaborative workplace environments. And specifically, training to improve listening skills and communication, therapeutic communication, to help clinical staff better relate to their patients. Next slide, please. Moving on into educational, we highlight some of the aspects of sex and gender-based differences that are currently being actually being implemented in some of the medical school curriculums, as well as allied health professionals, such as nursing, physiotherapy, OT, PT, as well as ensuring that there's continuing education, but not only continuing education, but competency training with certification maintenance required. So really ensuring that the future generations of care providers are well educated and understand these differences. Research, as with most funding agencies, and requirements now requiring that equal representation of females in all trials. We want to ensure sex and gender specific analyses are completed, as well as standardized documentation and reporting of disaggregated data. And there's also really appropriate study designs and tools to specifically detect sex and gender effects. And then finally, moving to my last portion that I'm going to speak to is the policy. Lobbying for government support targeting cardiovascular research in women and funding opportunities specifically for this research that really takes into account the diversity with a focus on ethnicity, diversity, and cultural impacts. Mass public health education and awareness campaigns are clearly needed, so we can really target these risk factors, risk profiles, and that women know what the symptoms are for presenting with heart disease symptoms. With recent years, we know that women of childbearing age and they actually have non-traditional risk factors that may place them at a higher risk down the road, such as gestational diabetes and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. And targeted risk factor awareness to focus on this pivotal point early in life is needed to ensure these changes for long-term health and well-being are made. So these culminating recommendations from both the literature and our women really leaves us challenged for our future and are key in order to really transform clinical care, clinical practice, and care patterns. So our final segment of this section refers to the patient's targeted action items for patients. And our patient expert is going to come back, Hope, and share these with you. So I'll turn it back over to you, Hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. So what can we do to help ourselves on our care and recovery? Attend recommended programming. Go to cardio rehab, excuse me, education, some peer support, very important. If it's not provided, information, ask for it, see if there is something out there. Get involved in research as a participant, patient partner, and be curious. When you be a participant in research, that gives us more information to help women with heart disease. Become more aware and educated. One's diagnosis and recovery, signs and symptoms recognition, make sure you know about these. Don't be like me, I didn't know anything. Understanding our own risk profile, that's very important. I didn't know any risk profiles, so that's why it's so important for me to have women know about heart disease. Become an advocate, self-advocacy, champion for your health. Advocate for others, share your stories and your recoveries. Get some peer support. It's so important emotionally to move on. And also for health-wise, you can talk to people about that. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Hope and Tracy, for these outstanding presentations, your insightful and thought-provoking observations, your conclusions and your suggestions. And, and Hope, thank you particularly for your courage in sharing your story, which is just so impactful, as well as how you have personally taken your experience and turned it into positive actions in your personal life, as well as in your advocacy life. We encourage everyone to access the article. It's freely available to all so that you can really dwell on these, think about these points a little bit more as they relate to your situations as well. And I would draw your attention to the chat box where we can find, where there are direct links posted. So please have a look there. We've also posted the link to the report on misunderstood. So in summary, I think that it's really important to realize that significant strides in the awareness of sex and gender differences for women living with cardiovascular disease have been made, but we still have so much work to do. And the lived experience of women is really key to our understanding this journey and to facilitating change. So use your voice, bring your voice up, find your local groups, and be able to, access the website, get more information through the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. We're here for you to be able to expand your knowledge base and to help you with this. I'm going to turn it over to Colleen for the last few comments here.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And, as I'm sitting there listening, I keep thinking of this advocacy role and trying to help women with lived experience be strong and know that they're doing the right thing and listening to their body. And I have to say, I have been taking care of my 93-year-old mom who's in an assisted care facility here in Alberta through COVID. And I've had to advocate for her. And I fully recognize, even with everything I know and all of my background, how difficult it is, because I frequently feel like I feel like the system is looking at me and saying, I wish she would just quit. Like we've heard from her enough. And I keep saying to myself, I know what I'm doing is right for my mom, and I'm gonna have to be the pain in someone's side because I'm not getting what I need. And so recognizing that, I want to give everyone who's on this webinar a hurrah, because you're here because you know that you need to advocate for yourself. We really want to educate in the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. We're trying to educate the healthcare workers and the healthcare providers so that when you go into an emergency department, they'll say, aha, oh, I need to pay attention to this, because they aren't the same symptoms for women and men, whether it's heart disease or stroke. So there is a critical need for sex and gender specific strategies. And I just want to remind people, when we're talking sex, we're talking the biology of being female or male. And when we're talking gender, there are gender specific areas. Those are psychosocial areas. What education, what income level, where do you live, where do you work, what's your role in the family, that actually affect outcomes. So the healthcare system needs to adapt to those, but we also need education awareness. We need clinical diagnostic protocols, supportive structures to reduce the barriers of being stopped at the gate. And as Sharon had said, chatted in between, saying the infographic on how do we open those gates, that should be our call to action for everyone, because they're really basic and they're telling us how we need to move forward in this. And obviously continued diligence and advocacy to improve outcomes for women. Every single opportunity we get, we need to talk about this. My own niece had a baby. She was gestational diabetic in both pregnancies, and this baby arrived a month early. From everything I know from the literature, if she doesn't start paying attention now, then in 10 years, she's going to have some heart issues. So, we need to tell our nieces and nephews and the people we know that are having babies, it doesn't mean it's the end of the road. It just means that you have to really pay attention and start adjusting your lifestyle, changing your lifestyle so that you avoid those outcomes. So next slide, please. Sharon?
Yeah, so now we've collected some really great questions in the question and answer box here, and it's time for us to be able to hear from you because we really want to know what your thoughts are. So let's start with the first question. It looks like it's directed to Hope. Very much great appreciation for your story. And could you expand on what drew you to the Women at Heart program? As a leader, this is from Roxy Hamilton, and she's saying, as a leader, I have seen a few ladies who start the program but opt out after stories are shared and told. And this concerns her as they seem to perhaps be the most that need the program. So what are your insights, Hope, on what drew you to the program and how you felt that, I mean, I'm sure it was challenging to share your stories, but how did you stick with it? And what was it that you were getting out of it? And what would you want to recommend to other women?
What I got out of it was just the how can I explain it? Intimate with the other women, especially after we were talking about, like, we told our stories. So then you just find I found that we bonded very well. And I think I mentioned that we're still in communication, and we're still there to support each other. So to me, it's I'm so happy for that support group, and I'm hoping that people will stick to it. It is really worth it. You learn a lot. You can speak up about heart disease and your medication, your exercise. It's just amazing that the group can do for you. For me, that's what happened to me. So I'm hoping, like you said, that women will stick with it and not leave too early.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, we all have our own personalities and our own flavors of what we're comfortable with, and you know, I do think that not the same thing is appropriate for everybody, but giving something a chance, because it will give you an opportunity for education and to be able to improve your own situation is certainly what I've heard from our patients. They find that it's really, really empowering to be able to learn through other women. And just as to a few words about the Women at Heart program, it is it's started at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, and you were fortunate, of course, to access it there.
Yeah.
But and the peer support program in particular has a very detailed training experience, so that the peer support leaders, who are women with lived experience, they go through a very rigorous training schedule and opportunities to be able to lead the groups and be able to share. And they have support as well from Ottawa. But what I really wanted to say is that we, in Atlantic Canada and Western Canada, we want to be able to offer this to all of the women across Canada. And so we are currently, Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance is working to try and enable this. And actually, it's a silver lining of COVID that we have become so much more virtual in many ways in our educational offerings. And so that now, it used to be you had to do this program face-to-face, and you probably did it face-to-face, Hope. Is that right, when you did it?
Yeah, yes, I was glad for that at the time. So, because and like, it really helped me too. Like, I couldn't say the word heart disease after the surgeon told me I had heart disease, and it was like a big hit to me, and I couldn't say that. I would say, oh, I have that condition or something like that. But with the group, I was able to say, yes, I have heart disease. So,
so acceptance.
Acceptance, exactly.
Yeah.
And Hope, we've done, focus groups with women, and that was a real aha moment for me, was the women saying that it was embarrassing, to be told that they had heart disease initially, because it's, the way our society is, if you have it, it's because you didn't take care of yourself in one way or another. And so it's getting rid of those myths, especially when we're looking at how women present. These are not women that are smokers and drinkers, and these are the people that are presenting nowadays are fit people. That's why they're all saying it can't be me. I follow a diet, I don't smoke. So it's just getting that awareness out that it's other things that may have caused this in the first place.
And just as you mentioned, Colleen, like the sex-specific unique, and Tracy, the sex-specific unique risk factors that women have, particularly related to pregnancy history, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, as well as other things, like polycystic ovary syndrome, and then our later years when we're postmenopausal, it becomes an issue. And we'll talk about, the more unusual pathophysiologies. There are ways that heart disease can present in women in other of our chapters, like SCAD, for example. Some of you are familiar with that, of course. But I just wanted to follow through too on the idea that the Women at Heart program, the idea is that not only will it be able to be delivered in person, which, well, nobody can have it in person right now, but it will be virtual. But because we've had to do with COVID pivot to virtual, then going forward in future, there will be an ongoing virtual opportunity that then extends it across the country. So actually, we're starting up a pilot site, we hope, here in Atlantic Canada very soon. And it's just such a wonderful program. So I'm looking at the chat box too, or question and answer box. And Tracy, I would really like you to answer this question from Diane King. Diane wants to know, how can rehab and support groups be started and grown outside of Ottawa, in particular from the rehab focus? So what are your insights and thoughts on that?
And because of COVID, sorry to interrupt, because of COVID, this is really grown by leaps and bounds. So Tracy, that'd be
Yes.
great if you can address
Yeah, that's a really good question. And from a rehab point of view, we have also, had to pivot with COVID. And as you were saying, Sharon and Colleen, about the whole virtual element, we've moved to a virtual cardiac rehab program. So it's not only, making it more accessible for everyone to be able to, hopefully, I mean, obviously, depending on if you have access to a computer, that sort of thing, but it does hopefully remove some barriers for some individuals. But specific to peer support, this is great because this virtual component, such as the program at Ottawa Heart, has that element of being able to be accessible to everyone across the country, right? We do have peer programs within our programs at Women's College and Toronto Rehab, but have not yet been able to move that to a virtual component. So that's something that we hope in future. But again, collaborating with our other programs, the Ottawa Heart Cardiac Rehab Program, in order to be able to offer these across Canada is wonderful. So,
Yeah. Tracy, could you
sorry.
just say a few things too? I was just thinking about the aspect of the cardiac rehab before we get to the peer support, or sometimes it can be like, done in a parallel way, or often it's very beneficial to pick it up after, formal cardiac
Right.
rehab, and then to be able to continue for the support that women need and can access. But can you say a few things about the primary cardiac rehab programs and how COVID has caused them to pivot to virtual, and maybe women's specific cardiac rehab programs and what you have been doing at UHN?
Yeah, so with COVID, we did have to transition to we have a virtual program and a hybrid program. And with our women's program, we also did start a Women with Heart online education opportunity for women-specific education. And that really does focus on women's topics that we have actually identified through women with lived experience through a needs assessment. And so these are available at cardiaccollege.ca. We also, as part of our traditional cardiac rehab program, we have what's called Cardiac College Learn Online. So again, stemming back to our on-site programming, this integrates nicely where all of the education components are available online, and in addition to the virtual cardiac rehab program. And so it's a really nice combination of being able to try to meet our patients' needs while we are going through this pandemic. And eventually, I believe that virtual will be a key component of all cardiac rehab programs that are able to do this. And even once we do come back to being an in-person program, these virtual programs are going to be just incredible for reducing those barriers for women, and both women and men, but women specifically being able to access related to, other commitments, as we know, other commitments, and being very much, back to work, that sort of thing after a cardiac event can really impact their ability to participate in a cardiac rehabilitation program.
Absolutely. And then the impact, of course, for our geographically disparate locations, right? So this will have a huge impact in being able to reach, beyond, I think really, non-urban women are definitely at a disadvantage when it comes to having access to cardiac rehab. There's just been no doubt about that. And there's a question here. So, and so many more questions, and they're all really great. And I'm sorry we aren't going to get in time, but there's still a question about what are the 5 unders, and the 5 unders. Okay, it's not your 5 underwears. It's under-aware, under-diagnosed, under-treated, under-researched, and under-supported. That's what the misunderstood report actually very clearly outlined, and they impact for women across the board. And we put the links to the that report in the chat box, as well as the direct link to the paper, the publication, the chapter 3 that we've been discussing in detail today. I'm going to give the last question here because we're wrapping up at the time here. There's a concern with respect to, you know, all these campaigns, the Heart Truth, the Red Dress, et cetera, have been working. We've been at this for a long time to improve women's heart awareness, maybe not quite as long in Canada. We were surprised by those results that you showed, Tracy. What do you think, you know, Tracy and Hope, from the perspective of a patient, why do you think we're doing so dismally? And Colleen, from your viewpoint as an epidemiologist, what's going on here?
For me, I don't know. Maybe the word is not getting out to the right people, or we're on social networking. There's posters, there's signs. So I don't know what's going on. Why we're not having any more success in that area.
Tracy, Colleen, any insights?
I just, you know, at the first thing I say, and this is probably my COVID temperament these days, is we're still sitting in a white male patriarchal society, and there's, you know, we have to battle this. That you know, if I'm trying to advocate for myself and someone says, well, that's not the typical, you know, I'd say I'd like you to check my heart. Well, you sort of aren't showing the signs and symptoms. I say, well, those are signs and symptoms for a white male. And so I'm walking in here telling you, this is what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And I want you to check it, right? Because I think there's still that societal thing to say, no, we know what we're doing. We've been caring for you guys for years. And so it's just trying to be positive and say, well, there's differences.
I think it's really a tough time reaching all of our women too. And there's a great question here, you know, how is research helping identify symptoms in minority and Aboriginal or Indigenous women? I mean, this is a big issue. That's where the uptick is actually in younger women that are women of color, are Indigenous women. It is really a serious issue. So we've got to be a little more creative about how we are reaching out to people and getting the information out there. I think I've been told that we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up here. I want to thank everyone for taking the time today to share with us your knowledge, your experience, and great questions. And we can put these other questions online, and we have an opportunity to be able to have you email things in to the website, the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance website, which is CWHHC@ottawaheart.ca. Before we end the session, we'd also like to remind you to please complete the webinar post-webinar evaluation that will appear in your browser window. It's going to pop right up when we go off air. A copy of this recording, along with all the Atlas chapter sessions, will be available later this week on our website at CWHHA.ca. And the conversation again, a good plug for our Twitter chat tomorrow night. It will be held between 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to continue the conversation there. The hashtag will be Her Heart Matters Atlas. And just follow at CWHH Alliance, and you'll be able to access all the conversation there as well. So on behalf of the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance, I want to thank our my co-moderator, Dr. Norris, and our wonderful speakers, Dr. Colella and Ms. Hope Sarfi. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and insights with us. And we wish you all a very good day, and please take care of your hearts and be well and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.